Very, very hot in the studio today. The show takes a lot of time, and part of what keeps the lights on is if you consider hiring me to edit your work. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. It could be a pitch, a proposal, an essay, hell, even a book. If you need help cracking the code, man, you can always email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and we can start a dialogue. If that's not your cup of tea, there's also patreon.com/CNFpod. For a few bucks a month, you help support the show, and you're part of a cool community of nonfiction writers who can talk amongst yourselves. It's kind of neat. Depending on your tier, you get some face-to-face time with me as well to talk things out. Because sometimes you just need to talk it out, man.
But she is like any other teenager, but she has to be braver than any other teenager, and she has to heal faster than anyone experiencing this kind of loss because it's integral to her own ability to live a life, to have a future.
All right. How's it going, CNFers? It's that Atavistian time of the month where we celebrate this month's Atavist magazine writer and editor. And this month, all the more special because I speak with the photographer of the story as well. No real spoilers here with this profile this week. We have Rhana Natour and Eman Mohammed, the writer and photographer behind this incredible story called Coming to America. Leanne Ilbaz lost her legs in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. To learn how to walk again, she had to travel more than 6,000 miles from everything she knew. Stories at magazine.atavist.com. Consider subscribing. I don't get any kickbacks, so the recommendation is true. This is an amazing story of how Rhana and Eman bring you up close to the human toll of these horrific and often indiscriminate bombings. Leanne is a firecracker, and she is a teenager, and she is angry, and she is grieving. And Rhana and Eman take us through that and tell us what they experienced, what the experience was like. Documenting Leanne's story and how Leanne showed tremendous agency and how her story could and should be handled. She's 14, and thanks to a nonprofit, she came to the U.S. to be fitted for prosthetic legs. Both are different in length and functionality, and as Rhana writes, it's like Leanne has to learn how to play two musical instruments at the same time. The story makes you feel things, man. Show notes and more to this episode are at brendanamara.com, where you can also sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. I'm not really on social media anymore, so the newsletter is my means of promotion, my means of communication, aside from the podcast. After spending about 6 weeks doing the weekly newsletter and watching dozens upon dozens of people unsubscribe, I'm going back to once a month. That was a furious spat of unsubscribes, and with a book coming out, I can't really afford for my platform to shrink even more. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Lots to get to in this pod. First up, we're going to hear from lead editor and editor-in-chief and author of Sisters in Hate, Sayward Darby, about her side of the table. Then we'll hear from Rhana and then Eman. Ready, CNFers? Riff. About this latest Atavist piece, and when I was talking to Rhana, actually post recording, we just were talking briefly, and we were just talking about how messy writing pieces are, and especially longer pieces, and we were just like really commiserating over how sloppy and messy it is. And she even told me, she was like, I write into my drafts that things are messy for the editors to be like, listen, I understand this is a shit show, but this is what I'm working with. And so just for you on your side of the table, understanding that most drafts through almost until the very end are indeed very messy, how do you keep things as clean as possible as you're looking to make that final push towards, hitting publish?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess I would say that some people are messier than others, and I don't mean messy even in a negative way. Some people just have a bit more of a. It's not even slapdash because that implies that there's not intention to it. I think some people kind of sit down and they're like, I just need to get words onto the page to get the juices flowing, to get the structure in place. And then there are people who, even in a first draft, and I'm more like this, kind of go back and polish every sentence. Like they can't stand the idea of not editing their work as they go. And I don't think there's like a right or wrong way, but sometimes messy quote unquote drafts where like the prose is not quite right yet. Maybe the prose hasn't even really been considered. It's more I'm just getting the story down, getting the facts down, getting the quotes I know I want to use down. Sometimes those are actually, I would say, in better shape quote unquote than stories that seem more polished on the surface, because sometimes I think it's a forest for the trees kind of situation, and people can get very hung up on, well, I want this sentence to sound just like this, but they're not necessarily thinking bigger picture in the same way. So it really just depends. Like sometimes I get a story in which the prose is sharp, the structure's good, and I've got maybe a couple of big picture points I need to make before digging into a line edit, just to clean things up for house style and grammar and whatnot. And then other times I'll get what I understand what Rhana is saying, like something that feels more like you just word vomited it out.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the edit doesn't take so long for me because I'm like, oh, well, this is all here. It's just clay that needs to be like molded into a shape, and it's where it needs to be. And so I actually also find that to be a pretty speedy process. What gets tricky is when neither structure nor prose is really there. And so you're just kind of looking at raw materials and you're like, wait a minute, I need to completely like reorient myself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, her draft specifically, her first draft. And I wouldn't at all call it like a mess. It was definitely written more quickly than most Atavist drafts, which I think just had to do with timing as much as anything else. Because we assigned this story in March, we knew we wanted to publish as soon as possible. And so, this will have been a relatively fast turnaround for us. It's also newsy. There, were things we have to be keeping track of in real time. The mess of it, if you will, I think had as much to do just with the timing we were dealing with as anything else. But we had also in advance talked extensively, and so had really talked about themes and structures and characterizations. And like I even had in mind some things she left out of the first draft where I was like, wait a minute, whatever happened to that thing we talked about? And she was like, oh yeah, totally, we can put that in too. The sort of prep in advance of actually having all the ingredients in front of me really helped make the edit move along.
And when it's fairly rare with the stories that you do that they are in fact kind of timely, have kind of a news hook to them, and that you have to kind of run through them quick. There's some have months or even years of lead time. So how does your editing change when you have to be far more nimble and far quicker than you typically are with most of the stories you run?
Yeah, I think in this case, again, the prep was really important because, for an Atavist story versus a more traditional feature, what we were looking at was how do we make sure that the plot, like the narrative, gets elevated. And in this case, what is the narrative, right? Because we had to accept that there would not be a conclusive ending. The situation in Gaza is ongoing, and does not seem to show any signs of getting any better. And we knew that her medical status, amongst other things, was probably going to be unresolved by the time we published. So the question was, if we don't, have those sort of obvious endpoints, then what story are we telling that will feel narratively satisfying? And one of the things we talked a lot about in advance of a draft even coming together based on, the pre-reporting Rhana Natour, the photographer, did before they went to meet the subject, and then after meeting the subject, was really about who she is as a person and how that sort of evolved, or not even evolved. It's more like she's a kid who had this absolutely horrific, like unfathomable thing happen to her. The airstrike that forced doctors to amputate her legs also took two of her sisters, a niece and a nephew. And then after arriving in the United States, her brother was also killed in an airstrike. She sort of had so much taken away from her, and she was very angry. And she's very angry at the beginning of the story. And what you are watching over the course of the story is like an emotional evolution where I think she's getting back as much as anything to kind of the kid that she, should be, right? With all of these horrific tragedies around her, but you really see a softening and a warming of her over the course of the story. And of course, there's a lot of context around that. We obviously talk about what's going on in Gaza. We talk about, the incredible crisis of pediatric amputees that is emerging now, and that we really just, as with all statistics in this situation, don't have really firm, numbers we can be confident in. And so that's all in there. But we really wanted to feel like Leanne as a character, her story and her journey over the course of time that Rhana and Eman had with her, felt really like, oh, okay, I see something has happened here, and kind of the question of who is she going to be by the end of the piece gets answered, if that makes sense. And so for us, it was like, well, we know that we can, in a matter of hours, quite frankly, we could pull together context and, giving people a lay of the land of what's been going on. And so that was never, a question from a nimble standpoint, to use your word. Like we knew that stuff was easy to pull together. And Rhana certainly has a background in, more newsy reporting. She's was a PBS correspondent, has worked for Al Jazeera, some other places. And I've worked in, more newsy stuff. It was again saying, okay, in preparation, as we're reporting this, as you're reporting this, how can we make sure that we are getting the narrative that will lay over that material so that we can, essentially it's sort of like a fondant on a cake or something, right? It's like, okay, here it is. And we're just going to like lay it over the top. So yeah, I would say that this story in particular involved a lot more. I was just in touch with writer and photographer. We had lots of long conversations before we debriefed after their trips. It was a much more sort of conversational process. And then just, we, in advance of going into production, worked with a fabulous fact checker who actually won a Livingston Award right before she started fact checking this story, Leila Hassan. And, just kind of having everybody on the same page about we've got to be paying attention to, updates, whether we're talking about intimate updates in the story, with regard to Leanne, her family, her host family, her medical status, but then also, what's going on in Gaza. And so actually right before we got on this call, I was going back and forth with them about like, what's the latest? Essentially, like, is there anything before we hit publish tomorrow that needs to be updated? Knock on wood so far. No. But, just with the understanding too, that things could change in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month. And, maybe we do update the story at that point. So yeah, it was, I'm really proud of this project, and it is rare that we assign a newsier piece, but when they pitched it, Leanne was just such a moving subject. And I feel like so many stories that we have, read or heard out of Gaza have, this just felt like it took the time to really let you get close to her and to show, again, her anger and her grief and her, all of that mixed with the fact that she's barely 14 and, is an adolescent girl. And, she's interested in makeup and she's concerned about her appearance, and any number of things that, I once upon a time was a 14-year-old girl too. And like, that was way before social media. And I just can't imagine, what it feels like to be a 14-year-old girl now. And on top of that, to have your life and your body blown apart, and I just felt like this was an opportunity to really get closer to that person and show them in so many different dimensions.
How important is it for you to have actual photography to accompany a story of this nature?
This was an unusual story for us in that normally, a writer pitches us, and if we feel like, oh, this is a story that, is going to involve photography, we find somebody, who's on location, wherever the, sort of heart of the story is, the main characters are located. And this was Rhana and Eman pitching together. So they knew that they wanted it to be a collaborative process and for the visuals to be a key part of the story. And so we were lucky in that we didn't, we obviously could have found somebody great, I'm sure, but Eman already really had a vision for it. Maybe she mentioned this when you spoke to her, but she lived in Gaza for I think 27 years and had to leave in 2014 because of Israeli attacks, and I think one of which injured her own daughter. And so there was just already this sort of intimacy and connection to the material. And we felt like for sure, especially because appearance, like the idea of what one looks like and how the world perceives and perceives of someone is so central thematically to the story. It felt really important that photography be not an afterthought, not that our art is ever an afterthought, but really be central. And this was a rare example too, where even up until like yesterday, we were like, wait, should we use this photo? Should we use this photo? Just to make sure that we really felt like we were elevating the text with the images. And Eman did an amazing job. Some of my favorites, because obviously not every photo made it into the piece, but I mean, first of all, I think she does a really beautiful job of capturing Leanne as an adolescent girl, who wants to look pretty, who wants to, and she even says this, she's quoted as saying that she wants to look like any other kid, in this story. But then some of my favorite photos that I found myself just kind of staring at endlessly are of Leanne in a grocery store in Chicago, which is where she's getting her medical treatment. The juxtaposition of the bounty around her with what we know about what's going on with the starvation of the Palestinian people in Gaza it's totally unspoken, right? But here she is in her wheelchair. I mean, just surrounded by every brand you can think of. It's so colorful. There's, my gosh, more food than it really, it feels like such plenty. And then knowing, the situation that she came from and the situation that her loved ones are still in because she came to the United States by herself. And I thought that was a really, I don't know how intentional that was on Eman's part, but I definitely found it to be very artful and political at the same time. And I think we ended up using one photo from that sequence where Leanne is in a checkout line at the grocery store holding this massive receipt. Like it goes on for like several feet, right? And again, it's like that contrast of, just having as much as you could possibly want versus barely enough of what you need, I thought was really profound.
Well, fantastic, Sayward. As always, it's always wonderful to get your side of the table on these things, and we'll turn it over to Rhana and Eman now. So, as always, thanks for the time and your insights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. So next up, we're going to hear from Rhana Natour. She's R Notorious on Instagram. That's RNATOURIOUS. Did I spell that right? RNATOURIOUS. Yes. And her website is rhananatour.com. She's an award-winning correspondent, journalist, and producer who specializes in documentary storytelling, digital explainers, and feature reporting. Her work has aired on PBS NewsHour, Al Jazeera, English, More Perfect Union, and Scripps News. She spent her early career in the Middle East, first as a U.S. Fulbright scholar in the UAE, and then in the West Bank as part of the producing team of Speed Sisters. Great stuff. Good talk coming up. So let's hear how Rhana arrived at this story.
How I learned about this story was from Eman Mohammed, actually, the photographer on this piece, who called me and told me that there were organizations who were evacuating children from Gaza, injured children from Gaza, to the U.S. And I was particularly struck around the injury of amputations. I just couldn't get it out of my mind. It seems like one of the most traumatic injuries that a child can sustain, even more so than being disabled, because it's the physical removal of part of your body. And once we started learning how many kids had lost limbs in this war, I mean, the only single data point that we have is from UNICEF that 1,000 kids in the span of 2 months, which is 10 children a day, were losing limbs. It was just a story that we had to do. And these organizations, HEAL, in the end, started working with us to see who we could talk to. And the nature of this injury and the nature of how deeply traumatized these children and their parents are meant that I talked to a lot of families. I had to talk to a lot of families who really couldn't even begin to process what happened to them. They were at the very beginning stages and they were too traumatized to even partake in this process. So finding Leanne and just meeting her and seeing the spirit that she had, the life force that she had to fight for her own future, to fight for herself, and to fight for her family, because they really wanted her to heal as well. It was just so inspiring, and I just loved the tenacity to which she pursued and is pursuing that goal.
Walk us through the conversations that you're having with the families so you can get the access that you want in such a way that it doesn't feel exploitative.
That was very difficult because going through an experience like this, many people were too traumatized to be part of a story like this. The parents were too overwhelmed, too traumatized. They hadn't absorbed what happened to them themselves in order to even be open to speaking to a journalist. And the kids were also too traumatized in a way, and they weren't even open to it. So it took a lot of conversations with a lot of families and a lot of children. And the idea was, we think that this is happening to a lot of kids, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kids. And we want to show the world what it's like to experience this. This doesn't just impact a child, it impacts everyone they know. It impacts the trajectory of the lives of their families as well as these individual children. And I tell them that we want to show that, and we want to show the impact that it has on a child. And this involves a lot of time with you. And are you okay with that? And some people said no, and we had to respect that. And I did respect that. And some people were really open to it. And that also involved dealing with the trauma that they experienced and what that does to their behavior and what that does to the reporting process. And I was prepared for that. And I understood that there would be a lot of curveballs because this just happened to them.
Like when you're able to zoom in on, let's say, Leon's story, it puts a face on it instead of these gross numbers that you cite in the piece, like approximately 15,000 children dead, 20,000 missing, 12,000 injured, and like those numbers might just glaze over someone as it's earth-shattering to hear those numbers, but they are numbers. But when you put a face to it with this one, brilliant, courageous teenager and the trauma she's going through, suddenly it hits home in a way that mere numbers don't hit home, if that makes any sense.
Right. And I think you understand that at the end of the day, every human being wants the same thing. They want to fight for their own survival. They want to fight for something. And once you see these kids, how far they're willing to fight, and you see a world that's just willing to let them do it on their own, I mean, it is infuriating because you see how she's no different than your own daughter. She's no different than your own niece. But somehow, I mean, this shouldn't be a necessary exercise. It really shouldn't be. But she is like any other teenager, but she has to be braver than any other teenager, and she has to heal faster than anyone experiencing this kind of loss because it's integral to her own ability to live a life, to have a future. And, recently I came back from a shoot, and I followed a girl who was an amputee from Egypt to the US, and a beautiful young girl who's missing a leg. And all the flight attendants were just horrified. They're like, how could this happen? How could somebody do this to this little girl? And how did this even occur? And I said, well, there's a war in Gaza and there are thousands like her. And they couldn't believe it. They saw this girl right in front of them that they'd been giving water and tea and talking to throughout this whole flight. And they were just so angry at the fact that somebody or something could hurt her, and couldn't comprehend that. I don't think some of them weren't following the war, but couldn't comprehend that this was allowed to happen to thousands of others.
What were your first impressions when you first met Leon?
I wanted to turn back around and get into my car. I mean, I thought, like, what do I do here? Like, am I allowed to do this? Like, we talked before, and it was a totally different. I was dealing with a different person, and I just kind of had to understand, because I had to read a little bit about trauma throughout the reporting process here before this and since, and that's what happens. It makes your moods more severe, and especially when adolescents are dealing with trauma, part of that process is aggression, is mood swings. That she can't be blamed for anything that she feels, and part of that is being on the receiving end of some of that, and that's okay. And so my first inclination is, oh my God, like, what should I do? What should we do? Should we just speak to someone else? Should we say thank you very much and turn right back around and get on a plane back home? I wasn't sure what the answer was. And, as we talked to her more, it was clear that she wanted to tell her story. She was insistent on that, but she wanted control. And I think when you are a child in a war, you don't have any control. And journalists will come up to you in your worst moments and document what's happening to you. And that may not be an image that you want remembered. That may not be an image that you want distributed. And I think she experienced that a little bit before. And she wanted to make sure that she had some control now that she was well enough, now that she was out of the hospital, now that she had some strength to make demands. And I respected it. And I admired her, because there was a force in her. There was like a life force, a spirit that she was fighting for. And it was just an incredible thing. I have a future. Don't tell me I don't. And don't make it harder for me to carve that future out for myself. And I could only admire it, even though it was a little bit tricky and scary to deal with, because it was a really aggressive demand. But what she was saying was entirely reasonable and something that I respected immensely.
You've been a reporter and a journalist for a while, but I wonder what the experience of reporting on this story, did for you, changed for you, made you better at what you do, or a learning experience that this story in particular, the impressions it made on you, especially, during the process of the writing and the reporting of it, but also going forward.
Well, dealing with children is a very high stakes endeavor. And I learned a lot about what should and shouldn't happen when dealing with kids and dealing with traumatized individuals. And it was one of the hardest experiences of my journalistic career, because there were times where I was uncertain of what the right thing to do was. Ultimately, I think we came out with a nuanced perspective of what this really is like, because the easier path is to go with a character that's really grateful and really happy and really kind of the perfect quote unquote victim, as they say, of just has everything that you want to hear to make yourself feel better about what's going on. And Leanne was unwilling to play that part. And that's what I loved about her, because that's really what happens in real life. The people that journalists choose to profile, in some ways that's a self-selecting process, because they might go with a character that's easier to deal with. They might go with a story that's easier to tell. They might go with a story that involved less landmines as a journalist or reporter or storyteller. This was not one of those stories, but it just had to be. That's what I loved about this, because it just shows that anger, it shows we don't speak about anger enough in people who experience something like that, and anger of children. We don't expect that kind of emotion. We expect, like the host mom Dina said, you expect sadness. But anger is also something that is really real, especially when it comes to adolescents. And what happens to them tells them something about the world that they're entering. And if you have your legs amputated in a war that the world is willing to watch go on and on and on, what does that tell you about the world as a 13-year-old?
And when you talk about agency and anger, here, her legs were amputated, didn't have much by way of say of that. It was, my understanding is it was probably best, but you also just don't know. I don't think she would have maybe elected for that, but I think it was probably the right call medically. And then she could have had family come over with her, and she learns about that later. And so she's very much alone in the States, even though she has this very empathetic host family. So you really, and then she's a teenager. So you get a sense of there is a cauldron of anger and angst here that is very, very justified. But, and I'm glad she leaned into it, and I'm glad you were able to convey it in a way, because it's very real and very raw.
We're not sure, even if she came with somebody, whether this anger would have subsided, but that's the kind of riverbed that anger went through, is because she came alone. But she might have found other ways to direct her anger. That's likely. But she came alone because adults who cared about her decided that would be the best course of action. They were very, very concerned about her mental health. She was disintegrating before their eyes, and they wanted to get her out. They wanted to give her hope. And that was that's a very, very painful choice for this family, to send their 13-year-old daughter to a country they've never been. She's never gotten on a plane before. This isn't, many people in Gaza that are evacuating, this is their first time ever getting on a plane. This is a place that has been closed off from the world. And their family members that go with them are full adults who've also never gotten on a plane, never been able to travel. So everyone is going in blind to this experience, and every adult involved did the best they could. And they were really confined by outside factors. And, she was mad about it. And that's a reasonable reaction, but it's not because it wasn't the right decision. I'm not sure what the right decision was, but she felt alone, and, she is alone. And it's, even if she was with a relative, she may have felt alone because she is singularly experiencing this. She's the one that is without her legs and has to figure out a future for herself. And that is going to be a lonely road, no matter who is with you.
Yeah, and you write in the piece too, as she gets her prosthetics and she's working through the physical therapy of that, and you wrote that these prosthetics were, because they were so different for each limb, is like learning to play two different instruments at the same time, and you're paying witness to that and everything. So just as a reporter, how delicately do you have to handle these sort of observational details to be of utmost respect and do as little harm as possible to your central figure?
Well, it was something that I was shocked to learn, that I really thought that getting prosthetics and learning to use them was a lot simpler. I just didn't realize how difficult it was. I knew it was difficult, but I didn't understand how prosthetics are basically not as advanced as we think they are. There was a woman named Dr. Emily Mayhew who really explained this to me so well. She said, you see Paralympic athletes running down a track with blades, and you think, we've checked that box. We haven't checked that box. The prosthetics that we are using and the prosthetics that these kids have as an option are essentially the same, basically, functionally, as the prosthetics that Civil War soldiers had. The main development, the main innovation was the mechanical knee. These smart bionic limbs are not something that children from Gaza can take advantage of. It doesn't match the realities on the ground for Gaza. They have to charge it. If they need a part, they're not going to be able to get that part. It's way too advanced. Technology actually doesn't solve the problem of making these prosthetics good for children. It's a design issue. It's not a technology issue. So if you make a kind of the iPhone of prosthetic legs, that actually doesn't solve these kids' problems. And I was just shocked to learn how difficult it is. And I witnessed Leanne trying to put on one of her prosthetics and she couldn't get it to fit. And it just took 15 minutes of trying to get this prosthetic to fit. And I realized why is because her limb swells up. And the size of her limb swells and is different sizes throughout the day. And that means that, imagine trying to put on your shoe and it not being able to fit and having to put it on 5 times, 6 times, 7 times in order for you to get out the door.
And compounding that is that, she's, 14 years old now. And so she's still growing, and there's going to be further complications of having to be refit for prosthetics. Is home going to be able to accommodate that, or is she gonna have to come back to the States, or does she stay in the States? Like, there are so many things that it's not like here are these prosthetics for you at 14 and happy ending. It's very much ongoing and lifelong, and the complications are really only starting.
The solution for these children, for these thousands of children, is going to have to be built and found in Gaza. We cannot evacuate all the kids that need this kind of specialized care, and it's so long term that they need to get it at home. For Leanne Albaz and for every other kid, that needs to be and we need to focus on the solution to be in Gaza. And this is why, because on average, a child amputee is going to need 3 surgeries a year until they stop growing. Even in resource-rich environments like the UK, like the US, sometimes they even wait until the kid stops growing in order to fit prosthetics because it is so expensive. So it is one of the most complicated injuries a child can have, being an amputee.
What's great, at least how you handle the story, is you just kind of you really just lay it out there through your reporting, through the time you were able to spend with her, and you get a sense of this, and you imbue it with the context. But it's handled very deftly in that regard. So as you were setting down to write this piece, what was on the forefront of your mind as you were looking to just tell, just lay it out there, illustrate it, let her story do the heavy lifting for you?
There was the micro story of Leanne Albaz, her journey, and then there is the macro story of the reality of why she was in this situation in the first place, what this injury is like on a medical level, and then what her future holds. And that there's not an answer to what the future holds. Really, it's still a choice, I think, an international choice. There is still time to make sure that there is a happier ending for her and for other kids in her situation. I don't know if I don't know if the collective, if the world will come together to really ensure that it's a happy ending for her, but it's not in her hands. It's not in our hands. It's really a collective decision on whether we're going to make sure that this war will end soon, that Gaza will be rebuilt in a way that allows for a future for Leanne and for all Palestinians in Gaza. And it's an enormous effort. It's probably the largest project in modern history. I mean, we've never seen a place so destroyed.
Yeah. Is Leanne still in the States right now?
She is still in the States.
Yeah, and so you figure what was the other day, yesterday or something. So Netanyahu is in the States defending this war, and here she is probably getting wind of this, and here's this guy responsible for her bombing her country into the Stone Age, and here she is listening to that. It's got to be a very problematic experience headspace wise. Be like, here I am in this country that's it's trying to make me better, but it's also one of the fundamental countries that is enabling the war to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine it's rather head spinning for a lot of people, not just her. And she's 13 years old. She has, I don't know if she understands, but she does. I think she does. I mean, I don't know if she watched that speech. I'd be interested to hear if she did. There are many people that helped make this decision and make this reality happen that goes beyond Netanyahu. I mean, there's a whole military infrastructure behind his decisions. They don't have to take his orders, like there are generals that don't have to say yes to everything he does. And there's a society that doesn't have to say yes to what he wants to do. But it takes people standing up. Yeah, I don't know what will happen, but he got standing ovations many, many times in the halls of Congress.
Yeah, and what is you as a reporter who covers this and really probably has more intimate experience of the cost of it than most people. When you see that, what's going through your mind and your headspace as you're watching that and metabolizing that?
As someone who's interested in reality and fact, it feels a little bit like being in the upside down. Because the military official that Bibi Netanyahu cited in his speech, who said that the IDF avoided civilian casualties more than any other army when it comes to urban warfare, he's the one guy that's saying this. Other military experts are saying the opposite. And there are many, many more military experts who are saying the opposite than are saying what this one military official says. And I think he believes what he says. I think he really does believe what he says. But that doesn't mean that it's reality. And that doesn't mean that it's fact.
Yeah, when you work in a fact-based world, it's maddening to see the malleability of the brain, of certain brains, and it's all the more maddening and scary, really.
It's very scary. It's very scary. I mean, the facts really speak for themselves. The numbers speak for themselves. And there's been a dispute about the death toll, but there's been no counter evidence to prove that it isn't real. And we see that it's real. I mean, all you have to do is look at the footage coming out of Gaza. That's all you have to do is pay attention to that. And then tell me if what Bibi Netanyahu's framing of this war, tell me that is correct after doing that.
It would be wonderful to keep unpacking things and keep talking longer about this wonderful story that you and Eman have packaged, because it is one of those things that it hits you like a sledgehammer. And the more we get these kind of stories out there, maybe the more the levers will turn to end these atrocities. So I just have to commend you on just an incredible job, and just thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you, Brendan.
All right, now batting third, we come to Eman Mohammed. She's a brilliant photographer, and her work brings you up close and personal with her subjects. She's at Eman It on Instagram, and her website is emanmohammed.com. She's a Palestinian photojournalist and senior TED Fellow, and the author, creator, photographer behind the photographic memoir The Cracks in My Lens. Her work is grounded in her Palestinian roots and heritage. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Le Monde, Vice, The Washington Post, among many others. Some amazing stuff, and she's going to tell us how she gets so close to her subjects, but also when to back off. And in particular, with respect to the camera, what is it about photography that really speaks to you as your trade?
I think it's just the ability to take the people there, like the text definitely gives you all the details and the information that you might be wanting to know, but the stories can only be illustrated visually by photo and video. And photo for me is my ability to put you there. If that's my only magical power, is just to take people into that moment that I'm seeing, freeze it, and put it capsulated into that specific frame and let them just dive in, be able to just soak that emotion or whatever the frame is giving and live it to the maximum, because that's what documentary photography does. But also, I don't think that there is any kind of word that can describe the emotions like the photo ability to do so.
Oh, for sure. It's words, as powerful as words are, they only carry you, so far, and images throughout history have a way of sometimes changing history and really evoking the very raw, almost unfiltered thing that we're seeing before us. And is that something of a draw too, that like images, no matter how brutal and how honest and painful to look at, they might affect change in some capacity?
Sometimes it's just you need to see it. It doesn't have to be like painful or hard. It just you need to see it. You need to have your eyes laid on how it looks like to be able to visualize it, because some of us have that ability to just visualize anything, and some of us struggle with that. I know, to me, at times it just depends on the topic and the theme. So I think it's really a power to be able to just encapsulate the moments.
As a photographer, and as you study other images, other photographers, and work you admire, can you point to a singular image or a set of images that really set you on the path that you're on, that really inspired you to do what you do?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I think I get asked that question quite a lot. I should have a better answer, but I can never say one, because I feel like it's constantly evolving. I keep on looking at. I grew up in Gaza, and so I grew up in a very dynamic environment that had always been affected by what you see. For a Palestinian, like everything that I saw and the world saw, it affected the course of my life and others. So I cannot say one, but I have to say that it probably was just a combination of so many images that I've seen in Lebanon in 2006 that were all very powerful, and they just pushed me even further, that cemented the idea in my head that the presence of a photojournalist in the field that we're at, especially documentary photojournalism, is very, very important. And for me, it was my calling.
I've heard other photographers talk about, say, like the best zoom lens is your legs, to get closer and as close as you possibly can. Is that something you find to be true, that you want to be as on top of whatever you're shooting as possible?
Absolutely agree. It also can be like it can be dangerous at times, or maybe levels to intrusive in certain moments. So I always like having my tele lens, but I do believe that there is value to being able to be close, because just the ability of being close is just such a power for people to be comfortable with you being close. That means that you mastered your craft. You know where you are, they know where you are, and everyone is comfortable with you, and you're not intimidated by your surroundings. You're at the top of the top. But I think it's also worth to say that it's case by case. There are so many situations that you don't want to not just overstay your welcome, but you also don't want to underestimate the sensitivity of the moment and think that you can be in someone's face when you can't. And think that oh no, I can do this, and you're like no, no, you might want to just take a step back, because as photographers we judge everything. It's like cooking, everything is like by a measurement, and you never know what is too much, what is too little, without being in the situation. And I just believe in it being with a lot of courtesy to the people who are being photographed. And that's something I never take out of my head. Like there is no recipe that I just apply to everything else.
Oh, for sure. And because of the nature of having the device of a camera in hand and then being up close and pointing it at someone, like you brought up just the word intrusive. It can definitely feel that way. In what ways do you try to hedge against that, to be as gentle with it as possible, while at the same time, having to do what you need to do to document what you're seeing?
I think putting it close but lower angle and being around the people, speaking to the people for quite some time, and feeling out what is the temperature, how do they feel about my presence, and then feeling how do they feel about me snapping a few photos that might not be the photos that I want, might not be the photos that I'm going for, but just feeling how is the reaction to me even raising my camera and just snapping. And now we're blessed with the technology that have cameras with silent shutter or mirrorless. So that helps us a lot, but you also don't want to always be sneaky, you want them to know that you're taking photos. So it's always the balance. It's continuously the balance. And to have there had always been old school that told us to be a fly on the wall, which is true. There's so much appreciation to that. But I'm one of the photographers who like to be there and announce, especially in certain situations where people don't like to be ambushed. They don't like to suddenly feel like, oh, you took a photo in a sneaky way. So it's kind of like it's hit or miss situations. And I think once they get to being bored by your presence, that's the sweet spot for me. That's when I'm like, okay, I'm good. They are good. We can keep going.
Right. Yeah. It's when I was looking at images from your body of work, and it comes across as a very empathic eye, and I wonder how you have been able to, over the course of your career, been able to take the camera and make it a tool of empathy and not just voyeurism.
I think I like documenting stories that I am close to some extent. I don't believe in too much closeness. Yes, there is too much closeness to some extent, but professionalism come and kind of stand to be a very clear defining moment within those stories. But I'd like to be close enough to be able to tell the story as well, to not be parachuting. There is value to parachuting at times, because there are, situations around the world where we need more journalists to tell the story. But I prefer to be on the inside. And the more I am able to understand it for a longer term, the more I'm able to tell you about the hidden parts of it. And I think that that goes a long way. And marginalized communities by nature like to tell the stories from within. They don't like to have someone who claim to be their savior to tell their stories, which I think is very clear by now. And a lot of advocates have been telling us this, and I'm just one of many who's just trying to emphasize the same point through the photos, through the stories, and through showing what is missing. And I think there's a lot of value to that.
And with the story for the Atavist and chronicling this just harrowing journey of Leon, in what ways was when you locked into this story, how personal was this story for you?
Very personal. I mean, I'm from Gaza. I lived in Gaza till I was 27, so I didn't just grow up there. I had both of my kids in Gaza as well. Leanne is in the age of one of my daughters, actually.
Oh, wow.
She's 14 now. My daughter is 13 and a half. So it's all way too familiar. And she lost both of her legs during an airstrike during the genocide in Gaza. So everything about it was something that I definitely needed to document. The world definitely needed to see. It was just the how. How can we bring it closer to the attention of the audience, especially in the United States? My daughter was a victim of one of the airstrikes in 2014. So it's something that I wasn't able to document as a photojournalist, for an example. Leanne's story was way more glaring. It's a story that cannot be sidelined. It's a story that cannot be ignored in the current atmosphere specifically. It's something that needed a lot of delicate approach because Leanne was also a survivor of a genocide that is an ongoing genocide. So you have a big component of PTSD. Her family are still in Gaza. She was the only person who came to the United States through that NGO HEAL. And so there are so many moving parts that made this story very captivating, very important to be told as a journalist, but at the same time, very extremely hard.
And as let's say you're with, you're in in the car heading over to meet Leanne, and just as you're getting ready to meet her, you've done some, some background research. You kind of know what you're getting into. But if I'm kind of like just over your shoulder and you're telling me what's happening, like what's going through your mind as you're getting ready to meet this young woman and document her story the way you're capable of doing it?
A lot of things where I was trying to, make sure that there hadn't been any updates with her family because her family are still in Gaza. So every day was kind of a continuation of the tragedy. So I was trying to make sure that there hadn't been something new that I wasn't aware of that happened with her in her world, because she's living in two worlds. She's living in Gaza and she's living in the US. And so I was keeping track of that. At the same time, she was 13 and she became 14 when she moved to the US. So you have a teenager who's going through all the normal phases of a teenager life.
Yeah.
And you have to take that in consideration. You cannot treat her as quote unquote a victim, and because she will reject that. And it's a very obvious thing, but we easily forget about it. It wasn't, there is no one story that is like the other during the aftermath, but this was not a complete aftermath either. So there were, again, so many moving parts that had to be dissected and like treated separately and all treated together. And Leanne is a person of her own. Like she has her own way of describing what she feels, how she feels. So I have to be ready to take that and not color the story with whatever I already have in mind. And that's something continuously I aspire to have in all of my stories. But it's also something that I have to remind myself of. So all of these components kept on like nudging me on my shoulders, and I kept thinking about, aside from that, how the photo story plays. She lost both of her legs, and she, as you can see in the photo story and in the story, she wears hijab. So there were and in our culture, it's okay to take off the hijab in front of women. So while she was sitting with me, she was comfortable in so many situations. She would take it off. So balancing the times that I can photograph versus the time that I can chat with her versus the times that I can translate what she's saying. It was a big story. It was way bigger than I anticipated.
Oh, for sure. And she, just the way Rhana's story reads, she is just a fiery personality, and I just feel for her so much, and I love her her personality that really comes through. Like she's just a firebrand. I really did she come across like that right away when you met her?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you can't help it but love her, feel that ability of, she's resilient. She's very resilient. Children her age are known to be this resilient, but you cannot help it but wonder, like, if you will ever meet someone as amazing as Leanne. Like, she has this kind of charisma that will leave an impact on you that you will not forget for a very long time. She definitely has this fiery aspect to her. She's angry, rightfully so, at the whole entire world. She went through unprecedented, tragic event through her life. She continues to. There is so much to unpack through her story, but the most beautiful, at the same time powerful thing is that she unpacks it for you. You don't touch anything. She tells you how the story is going to be told, and to me, that's exactly how documentation should go. She's the one who's showing me what's going on through her story. This story was very sensitive and required a lot of delicate approach. Everything that I was able to capture in photo depended so heavily on how Leanne felt in that moment and in that day. So wherever her whatever her mental capacity and whatever her ability to express herself, wherever she was in that day, that's what I was able to capture. And it all was relying on being able to reach her and approach her accordingly to how she felt. It's also depended on her not feeling the camera so much, because anytime that she would feel the camera, you can see this wall building up again and just her shutting down. So it was a lot of hurry up and wait, because the Leanne that you see through the photos required so much time to warm up and just be present. And I think that is the beauty, but it's also the hardship of being able to document something with that high sensitivity. When PTSD is involved, when so much trauma and so much hardship in a story all combined together, it was beautiful to see her glow through some frames, and it was heartbreaking to see her just completely shut down. And there were frames that got thrown out, frames that got included, but it was all depending on that moment and that moment only.
It strikes me that maybe this case, unlike other stories, it really required a tremendous amount of patience on your part also. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely. Mine and hers. I think a lot on hers as well, because we just both learned that we had so many conversations about what is this going to result to. And to have that conversation with an adult is different than to have it with a 14-year-old teenager, and to explain that she will need to decide what she wants to see of a photo story about herself, accompanied by text. So it was a lot, and it was a lot of patience as well as conversation. I think there was a lot of beneficial conversation that was brought to the surface, and she was a champion walking through all of it.
Right. And, towards the end of the piece, this is when, Rhana kind of pulls herself and you into the story a bit. And Leanne, she said, I don't want you to take photos of me that include my injury. And right off the bat, she's like, she has that agency that she doesn't want to be seen as necessarily a victim or just like this a token injured person. She wants to be seen as an individual who just happens to be, tragically injured.
Right. And it's not that uncommon, to be honest. and during aftermath stories, typically she definitely did not want to be seen as a victim. She had so much power and resilience, but she also had a lot of trauma, and it was very glaring, very obvious, unprocessed trauma that we had to be very delicate around. I had to remind myself and Rhana that this is not a story that we typically just cover and move and continue covering other aspects. This is a story that needs to be handled very, very delicately because, again, she is 14. She's gonna present a lot of power and a lot of resilience. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of trauma and pain and suffering. But that's the beauty of covering the whole story through her eyes, through her experience. It's her story.
Do you find also that, given that you're from Gaza and Palestine, that you're able to forge a quicker bond and a quicker trust that maybe allowed you inside quicker, or certainly more intimate than just about any other photographer who might be allowed into her orbit?
I believe so. I don't like to overplay that hand or even underestimate the severity of the situation that I'm going into, for two reasons. Because I know the trauma because I also dealt with it myself. So it's so raw and it's so sensitive. I definitely know the bond and know the connection. So did Leanne, and that is a bittersweet kind of aspect to it. It makes it harder at times because we know how we're perceived in the outside world, and we know what to avoid, what not to avoid. But it's not know-it-all kind of situation, it doesn't mean it in a way that it makes us immune in the perspective of what to do from here. Even while talking to Leanne, I still was not fully aware of what she wanted to present till she was able to tell me with her words. I still needed to emphasize that she has agency, that she can tell us what she wants, that she can stop the interview. You know what I mean? There are aspects that cannot be forgotten or disregarded because I am from Gaza. In fact, it's important to just remind the storyteller, in that case, Leanne, of them even twice or three times as much, because we're from the same place and we don't like that to be ever forgotten. So I think it's a bonus for sure, but it's also a very, very sensitive, delicate aspect.
Yeah, and speaking of that agency as well, there's a moment later in the piece where she's at her physical therapy, and she allowed you to photograph her on her test legs, but she, as Rhana writes, shoot the camera away when Angela, the PT, was stretching her body without them. And, right there you get a sense of the agency and what she's comfortable with and what she wants to project.
Yes, and I had to make sure to let her know that she can cancel any kind of approval that she already gave, because this is a situation like no other. And she knew fully that she can always retract her approval to these kind of situations, because the photos that were taken got filtered through once and twice and three times. She wasn't only a child who was in the US injured, double amputee, but she was also alone without her family. She had no guardian, which made things much, much more complicated. In regard of the interviewing process, that was the case as well. So there were so many times where I had to remind her, I know that you're feeling uncomfortable and you can tell us to stop. I know you're feeling uncomfortable. You can let us know that you need a break. these were very important things for us. It was not that moment that she just realized that she can do that. It was a very, very spoken agreement that at any point you feel uncomfortable, you can tell me. And there was the language barrier, so that was not underestimated either. I had to make sure that she knows this is not how it goes. She also spoke about how she felt at times when people were photographing her in the past. She mentioned one time when she was she was drugged and she did not feel comfortable with cameras being in the room. So that made her even more comfortable. And I take that as, I appreciate that, because I know that she was that comfortable to vent and let me know that she feels that she can trust me and know that I'm not going to take those photos and run.
Right. And I guess one other thing I'd love to ask you is, as someone who deeply immerses herself in your subject matter, you're very up close to seeing things that you can't unsee, and you're taking pictures, and then you're going back and you're processing them, you see them again, and then you might even see them again upon publication. So you're deeply immersed in what can be very traumatic material. And I wonder what things do you put in place to maybe allow you to not like therapy, but the properly synthesize things so it doesn't totally bring you down into the total darkness, if that makes any sense.
Of course. No, it does. It absolutely does. And it's such an important question. I keep my emotions in check in the sense that I keep reminding myself that I also can pause. I can stop. It's both ways. Layan can stop. I can stop as well, because both of us are in a very grilling interview. It's very hard for everyone involved, and that's okay. That even inspire confidence for the person that you're interviewing. It's harder when you have other elements involved. The more people are involved in the feature, it becomes a little bit harder or less convenient. But I keep myself in check. I keep my emotions in check. I have my process. I have my mental aspect, my emotional aspect process. I don't edit right away. And when I edit right away, I leave a few weeks between the second round and third round of edits. I keep this good kind of relationship between me and the person that I'm working with, in this case, Layan and her host family. They do have a lot of leverage over the photos. They can choose while we're shooting where we can shoot, where we cannot shoot. And that's solely because of how sensitive the topic is and because she's a child. There are exceptions that are made to also give me the peace of mind, so I wouldn't have to struggle a lot with this. I definitely sing the praises of therapy, because we're talking about a lot of PTSD here, and a lot of it's a story that is heavily involved with graphic details, with the hardship of war and the consequences and the aftermath. So you have to facilitate it and process it with specialists. She also dealt with a lot of specialists on her end, which helped. So there was really a big team working on this. It wasn't just me and Layan, or me and Layan and her host family. But I value having loose requirements to what can stay and what can be killed in regarding of the photos. And that puts me at ease, because if I have to stress about each and every photo that Layan decided to take out, that would drive me nuts as a photojournalist. But it doesn't, because I know that given her even bigger ability or longer bandwidth to say yes and no, puts me more at ease, make me feel like she is going to be happier with the representation of her story.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Eman, your work's an inspiration, and it's so beautifully and sensitively done. And I'm so glad we got to, have this conversation about this piece for the Atavist and your contributions to it. So I just thank you so much for the time, for talking a little shop and giving us some insights into how you went about the work for the story.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Gosh, what a trip. What a trip. Thank you very much to Sayward, Rhana, and Eman. No parting shot this week because this pod is pretty long. Many voices in this pod, and I'm not going to tag on another few minutes of whatever nonsense that I'm usually up to. So remember, if you dig the show, pass it along and subscribe so you never miss these incredible guests who grace the CNF and airwaves. If you can, subscribe to the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter at brendanmeyer.com. Hey. And remember to stay wild, CNFers. And if you can, do interview. See ya.